I want to talk today a little bit about folk art and folk craft. What is folk art? Our perspectives have altered greatly and for the better. They're no longer the outpourings of the so-called unschooled and unsophisticated. Today, folk art can be fluid and include many mediums and creators. It can also be seen as genuine or created for commercial marketing. So when is folk art culture? And when is it exploited? And when is it celebrated? The first example I want to use in this is quill work, Mi'kmaq quill work. Now, we're talking about the most exquisite work in birch bark, of basketry, of water vessels, of cradles, that initially, pre-contact, was done with natural dyes and porcupine quills. Then when you started to get contact, trade beads were introduced, and trade aspects of cloth, fabric, things like that, were also incorporated in this beautiful quilt work. So we can see a morphing already of a traditional art that was also a craft, because these were utilitarian items as well. We see it morphing of the traditional aspect of folk art and craft to then changing because new things are introduced. And I'd like to suggest that that's basically the way that all of this stuff works. I remember talking to Helen Creighton about folk songs and saying, how do you feel about somebody taking one of the songs that you collected from, say, Nathan Hat and Middle River and changing it around and doing things? And Helen agreed with me, is that as long as you keep the intrinsic quality of the song, you can interpret it in any way. Because the whole idea is that if you don't use it and alter it and allow yourself to change it, it's dead in the water. Then it becomes an artifact. You put it in a museum, nothing ever happens to it. But that's not the way that folk art and folk craft goes. Also, you find that these things come with different meanings. I'm going to go away from quill work now and talk about an aspect of weaving. For a number of years, Sharon and I had a design company, and I wove a lot of fabric for it, including fabric for historic restorations, places like Ross Farm, Sherwood Village, those kinds of things. Traditional weaving of fabrics, as well as very high-end wools and silks and those sorts of things. But I'll give you an example. The 18th century shirt that was often made for men was linen, and it was long because very often there was no underpants more. You wore it between your legs. The whole idea of shitting on the shirt tail, it doesn't just come from nowhere. But one of the other aspects of this was in the craft and the art of making the shirt. But then if a young woman was going to make a shirt for her intended lover, she would put a heart at the base, because when you take the fabric, you just cut it down the center so far, but you need a way that doesn't ravel and run. So you hand stitch a heart on there. Now that's going into folk art, because you're doing a representation in a utilitarian garment. And we see these things moving together. They very often will be in the same thing. In the Gaelic community, the hearts is a wonderful story told in Gaelic that Helen Creighton collected, but I'll tell it to you briefly in English, because I don't speak Gaelic. There was a wedding, and a young woman was getting married to a man that she sort of thought, okay, my lover's gone away, I'll never see him again. After a few years, she decided to marry this other man. And this stranger shows up. And he shows up at the wedding ceremony, and before they got married. And lo and behold, he has the linen shirt with the heart that she had embroidered. And it's that, bringing that symbolism back in of fidelity, true love. I'll give you an example of a little Gaelic love song that sort of ties into this. You will recognize the melody. It's a well-known one that the Rankins sing all. They used to sing all the time. But they did it more of a dance aspect of it. as opposed to the way that I'm going to sing it in a more traditional way that Helen Creighton collected. Morgen Giles, 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 Morgen Giles, Matilda, Hatimi Regre da Vulcanutmi, Ochoin Yagulsam, Amishachi. Is trug na floming, rich na fulin, Anale udra merventau, Ester skribach dan jeren ilach, Farben skribi, gach minchen traum. My faithful fair one, my own, my rare one, return my fair one, oh hear me cry. For me, my maiden, I'm sorrow laden. Without my fair one, I'll pine and die. Morgen Giles, 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 Morgen Giles, Matilda, Chadimi Regre da Vulcanutmi, Ochoin Yagulsam, Amishachi. When we look at something traditional like Mi'kmaq quillwork and where it's gone today, and where Mi'kmaq basketry has gone today, it is phenomenal, phenomenal, the art that is being created by traditional craftspeople that may be called producing folk art, but also by highly skilled, not to say that the tradition bearers were not highly skilled for a minute, but people taking it and morphing it into other things. Now they're not necessarily creating it for a utilitarian purpose. It is a decorative thing. It is meant to be displayed, not just used. You pick it up, you take it to the market, you bring it back home, you set it, and it's filled with apples. This is a display piece. The whole concept that you see now in a lot of the Mi'kmaq gift shops of the wooden flowers, that developed because of the tourist industry, of producing these finely shaded wood petals and turning them into wooden flowers. Or even the concept of a ribbon skirt. Traditional Mi'kmaq clothing, when it was made of caribou or deer hide, were the skirts with woodland dyes and dyes from the earth. You know, so there were usually browns, reds, and then when contact came, you started to be trading with beads, you started to be trading with fabric, especially red fabric, and that was very popular, and ribbons. So then those started to be sewn onto the Mi'kmaq. So by the time Mi'kmaq clothing, so that by the time you reach the latter part of the 18th century, there's a lot of the Mi'kmaq clothing that's being made by these incredible quill work and beadwork and ribbon work people that you're starting to see in the skirts today. And here's where we have to come up with a question we have to ask ourselves about how do we assimilate or even take on some aspect of folk art or folk culture? When is it appropriate for a non-Mi'kmaq person to wear a ribbon skirt? I've talked to a number of tradition bearers in the Mi'kmaq community about such things like that. When is it appropriate for somebody like me to sing a Mi'kmaq song? There are certain songs that I would not be permitted to sing, and it would be a great insult if I sang a certain song. But there's other songs that I've worked with people in the Mi'kmaq community that they say, that's fine, that's a lullaby, that's fine. A ribbon skirt's the same thing. It's a cultural thing. It's part of their art, their folk art. And you have to decide by usually talking to a Mi'kmaq person and being given permission. It's like being given permission they will give you, they give you an eagle feather. It's a great honor. But for you to start carrying around an eagle feather and representing yourself in a different way, then that's not necessarily acceptable. So early on, the traditional porcupine quill work began to be augmented by the trade beads, as I said earlier, and we formed a new form of art. So another aspect that I mentioned earlier were basketries. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to pass around an example while I talk about this. And this is just the cutest little basket. Can you imagine having that? Which we do. That's a miniature of a black market basket. And they also, in the black community, with this particular technique, they would make art pieces as well, cornucopias or decorative pieces. Eventually morphed into even things like lampshades. But this is a traditional work that was carried on by the women. And it's important to note that the basket making work was not done solely for amusement or for extra pin money. Many of the times, these were utilitarian baskets, and some of them were huge. You could carry babies around in them. They would use them for everything. And the selling baskets in the Mi'kmaq community and with the black community at markets and going door to door was a major source of their income for some of the black families. And the early markets were frequently the only kinds of businesses that these two marginalized people were allowed to participate in. It was a way for them to move about the community, selling something that was considered legitimate for them to sell. Now, this particular basket, and I'm going to say this, and if I'm wrong about any aspect of it, Sharon will tell me, because I want to get this right. Nancy Lucas made this basket?
As far as I remember, it was Mrs. Creighton.
Okay, so that's what I was afraid I might get it wrong. So the two major people that kept this tradition alive were Edith Clayton and her sister Nancy Lucas. And when Sharon went down and started the costume program at Sherbrooke Village and then ran the costume department for a number of years, she wanted the guides to carry not a plastic bag around, but a beautiful market basket. So she would go every week and buy baskets from Mrs. Lucas. And finally, Mrs. Lucas said, "What are you doing with all these baskets?" And Sharon said, "Well, the guides in Sherbrooke Village are having them." So we developed a lovely relationship with Mrs. Lucas. We never called her Nancy, always Mrs. Lucas. And she made great bread as well. But Sharon said, "Would you make me some miniatures?" So we have them on our Christmas tree. And but this is exactly what they look like. Now, is that folk art or is it folk craft? If you put enough chocolates in it, it's a utilitarian item. But if you hang it on your Christmas tree, it's folk art. So it's dependent upon the use of the material. Another thing I want to talk about here are mats or rugs. Now, in this area, what do you call a hooked something that you put on the floor? A mat. In some parts of Nova Scotia, it's called a rug. Where I come from in Sherbrooke, you always put in a mat. You never put in a rug. You put in a mat. Canadian folklore scholar Marius Barlow, who was Helen's mentor at the National Museum, he studied the origins of the hook, what he called the hook rug. But he suggests it's a Canadian source and perhaps even Nova Scotia. We do know that rugs were made in this manner by the United Empire Loyalists, but did they bring them here or were they conceived in this new land? The old rugs would be hooked in hemp bags, unraveled, and then 5 strands put together and dyed, hooked onto a jute or heavy fabric backing. When I was a kid growing up in Sherbrooke, there was always, in the wintertime, there was always a mat in the mat bars with the mat clamps on it. And even the kids, we would do the outlying areas because that, you were expected to learn that. It was what you were taught. My grandmother at that point was not using yarns or anything. She was using my grandfather's old underwear to dye with Ritz dyes and then cut into strips. And that technique of using more wool in it, or even using that kind of lifting it up with a hook and trailing it back down again, is known as thrumming. And it's fastening these thrums. And the thrums, if you were a weaver, when you finish the warp, there's always a piece that fits the loom that you can't bring all the way forward and weave it. So there's always this end of maybe 30 centimeters or something like that. And those thrums were never thrown away. You could use them to knit fabric for the back of mittens to make them thicker, or you could put them into rugs, you could stuff them into a pillow. If you took the time to raise that sheep and process all the wool, you weren't going to throw away 3 pounds of wool or even linen. You were going to use them all. But those are the kinds of things that people took the folk craft, and then they turned it into what I would consider to be folk art, because their own artistic expression came through. People would draw on the rugs. My great-grandfather Burns was a folk artist, and he would draw designs on the rugs that his wife, my great-grandmother, and then his daughters would hook in the wintertime, with the odd guy sitting around doing a little bit of the hooking as well. And these became expressions of their own area, their own place. It might be the lighthouse at the mouth of the St. Mary's River, or it could be a salmon. And then what often happens, we see, is that if those traditions aren't kept up by an artist within the family, and they weren't, then people moved to the more commercial aspect of it. Then they started to buy, in my family, they started to buy the already stenciled designs from Garrett's in New Glasgow. So we lost the folk art part of it to more of a craft. But one of the reasons was that craft then became utilitarian, because my grandmother would knit these mats, and there was a man, I'm sure you've all heard these stories before, there was a man that came around and he would buy all these mats and he would give them linoleum for the floor. And I remember, even before she died, I do remember asking my grandmother about this, and I knew the answer. I said, you know, were you all right with this? Because you knew that he was going to resell them. And she said, I can make mats all winter long. I can't buy linoleum without money. So it was a win-win situation for her. She was using her folk art and her folk craft to turn it into something else. So it's not always you sort of think, oh, well, I would never produce my craft or my art for monetary gain. Yeah, sure you would. If there was a way for you to supplement your income, that's exactly what you're going to do. Patterns depended upon the area. Obviously by the sea, there was a lot of nautical patterns. I want to talk a little bit about an incredibly interesting pattern that I came across in a cottage of my friends in St. Margaret's Bay. This cottage was built in 1920, and it was built by a relative of Helen Creighton's. And he was a professor in the United States. He was originally from here. He was a professor in the United States. They would move up in the summertime. They would take the coastal steamer, then a train to the St. Margaret's Bay area. They'd stop off to be picked up in a wagon by Mr. Bootler, and they always ordered ahead of time a gallon jug of fly root, black rum. So they went to the cottage, and then I think around the first year they were there, they commissioned a couple of local women to make mats to go on the floor. And this one mat, it's just so beautiful. It's got a lovely, well, of course the colors are faded now. It's got a lovely interior design and very scrolly things. But the outside of the mat, the entire border, is what today we would call a swastika. And that was not an unusual symbol to be used. It's still not an unusual symbol in other parts of the world. In Hindu symbol, you can paint that symbol, which is the 4 winds. The Hopi Indians use that symbol. It's a universal symbol. It just happened to have been taken for horrendous use as another form of iconography. I have photographs of men from the 1920s wearing stick pins with a swastika on it. Not something that was used as a form of evil, because this was even before the rise of Nazism. We're talking the 1920s. We're talking that this rug that I'm talking about was probably made in 1922. So what I find interesting is that we are making judgment calls today on what is acceptable as folk art or folk craft to acknowledge and to celebrate A couple of years ago, Sharon and I helped out in a project with the Nova Scotia Heritage Rug Registry. And working diligently on trying to, they're not collecting the rugs, they're just documenting them. So they're asking people to take photographs of them, measurements, if possible, who made them, how they were used in the community, what is it, an original art, is it a Garrett stencil print that was redone. So I was really excited to document this rug from my friend's cottage. And they wouldn't accept it. The board of directors said they wouldn't accept this rug, and they wouldn't accept a similar rug with a similar image that they found in Cape Breton. So at what point do we, as folk art collectors, have to make a decision of when is it politically correct, or at what time in a span of a lifetime is that not acceptable? And the other aspect is that I always have to ask myself, dealing in history and folklore, is if we lose it, there's a way of documenting it and saying this is not the symbol that we think it is. I'm just using this rug as an example. If this is not the symbol that we think it is, then what is it, and how is it used, and how is it important to people of my heritage, my German heritage, who were the founders of my craft family, or some of the original founders of Lunenburg. That's my German heritage. And if that disappears, then that swastika symbol from my German heritage is only allied to one thing. It's only allied to the Nazi Party. And that negates part of my ancestry. Another aspect of it is look at the Shedikon rugs. Now those are usually done with fine wool, mostly floral patterns, beautiful, stunning, and they're absolutely wonderful. But those were done in mostly the Shedikon area and the Acadian communities. And those early designs were mostly geometric designs. Rhubarb root was one of the things that they used to make the yellow dye, as was onion skin. And then the initial development of what we see now as the commercial aspect of this came from a New York artist, Lillian Burke, who was introduced to the area by her friends, Mabel and Alexander Graham Bell. And she saw these rugs being made, and she thought, well, if I introduce more floral designs, we can expand the market. Today, they're considered an aspect of folk art. But we have to look back and see where this development came. Doesn't take anything away from the beauty and the quality of the work. And then you get people who said, okay, well, you're providing me with floral designs, but you know, I can come up with my own designs. And then you have it going back. You know, taking it initially and commercially, now you have it going back. It all weaves in. So, do we have a death of folk art and craft? I would say no. I would say what we have are differences. Somebody who might have carved something only in wood a number of years ago, they're adding new techniques. I'll give you an example. My grandmother was a very crafty person, my grandmother McKay. And one of the things that she made a number of, I sort of wonder where she got these, but anyway, she did. They were booklets. They sort of opened like this. And they were held together by crocheting all the way around. But what she was holding together were old X-ray sheets. I don't know where she got them. There was no X-ray on it. They must have been somehow wiped clean, or I don't even know how they did it. Stupidly, I never asked because I was only young at the time. But there is a folk craft. I wouldn't necessarily say it was terribly artistic because the outside was wallpaper, extra wallpaper she had, and the inside was these plastic things. But for her, it was her artistic expression. She chose the color of the yarn, she chose the color of the wallpaper. Art comes in many forms. For her, it was a real, direct expression of what she was doing. I wanted to just go back where I talked about my German heritage and share a little song that Helen Creighton collected here in Lunenburg County. from Mrs. Wright, Miss Wright. And it's a song that was brought over by the German settlers. When Helen Creighton, strangely enough, you got to love this, she came down and collected primarily in Lunenburg County, and then very early on, after that, wrote a book called The Folklore of Lunenburg County. It's out of print, but you can probably find it in libraries, things like that. She was collecting down here during the Second World War. Now, during the Second World War, she decided to come to a community where some of the people still spoke German, and you would be suspect if you're traveling down the roads with a recording machine. She talks about going down a country road one time, and she heard the peepers, the spring peepers, and she thought, this is absolutely marvelous. This is the kind of mind this woman had. This is absolutely marvelous. Maybe this won't be here forever. I'm going to get out and hook my battery up to my, wasn't a tape recorder, it was a Presto recording machine. She had to put the blank acetate disc on there, and then as she was recording it, she had to take a paintbrush, a clean paintbrush, and flick the filaments off the brass spindle in the middle. Because the record had to be cut going out this way, so the filaments could be collected. She was recording spring peepers when children came along. And she thought, okay, because she had actually had to go and rescue another man, bail him out, that was down here from Toronto University as a linguist. He was down here collecting German dialects too during the war. Hello, this is not the right time to be doing it, but they did it anyway. So she had to say to these children, this is what I'm doing. And she played them a recording of the Peeper Frogs. So when they went home and told that there was a strange lady in a car with a recording machine in Lunenburg County, but she collected some of the wonderful stories and some of the wonderful songs. And only because I love it, I want to sing this song. Es regnet der Kuckuck wird nass, und werden die Blumen im Grün wird das Gras. Wir bringen Sägen heraus aus dem Haus, die schnelle Kutsche, wir fahren im Haus. Es regnet, der Kuckuck wird nass, und werden die Blumen im Grün wird das Gras. It's raining, the cuckoo is out, the grass it is green and the flowers are out. May rain bring you blessings, come out of the house, quick into the carriage, we're all riding out. It's raining, the cuckoo is out, the grass it is green and the flowers are out. In Kingsburg, Helen Creighton collected a story from a woman who said, life was so hard here that when the families in Germany would write and say, should we come over? We didn't answer. Because if we told them how hard it was, they'd say, we told you so. But if we lied and told them how it was manageable, they might come. So those are the kinds of decisions these people made. And in the midst of it all, they still were able to produce art. It's a primal thing. People need to do that. They need to take what their everyday life is and somehow turn it into art. Another example of this is the whole concept of braided hats or chip hats. Do you know what I mean when I'm talking about this? You see examples of them at Ross Farm. You take some kind of straw, whether it be wheat straw or rye straw or things like that, and you braid it, 7-step braid, 8-step braid, 5-step braid, and you make long chains.
25 yards.
About 25 yards. Sharon and I have both done this kind of thing. It's very therapeutic. You're sitting there and you shove the other end of the straw inside, and you keep going, you keep going, you keep going. But then you have to sew it and form it into something. And that's where people took this utilitarian aspect of it and started to turn into folk art. Because the hat was an expression of their own desire. So if they wanted a big brim hat, or if they wanted a hat and then we're going to add some other aspect of it too. The technique that we know of that was still being used came to Nova Scotia in the 18th and early 19th century. And as early as 1770, these hats were mentioned in the newspaper of the Nova Scotian. And they were probably of import quality, but then very soon after that, they started to be made once extra grain could be sustained. The first few years of growing crops, you needed everything. You were maybe going to fill a mattress or put it on the floor or something like that. But then once you had extra stocks after you weaned the wheat or the rye, and then you had this extra grain, then you could start producing these utilitarian items. People in Lunenburg County made hats for sale and for their personal use. And straw hats, I love this. Straw hats were sometimes referred to as cow's breakfasts. Get ready for church and put on your cow's breakfast. Here we go. I'm going to give you a quote from the Nova Scotian, the newspaper of the Nova Scotian of April 1830. It has a headline in the ad, "Fashionable straw hat industry. Seaman Fail respectfully informs her friends and the public that she has removed from Granville Street to the corner of Grafton and Blower Street, where all orders in her line will be thankfully received and punctually attended to." So it was an industry. But then you take an industry that is an industrial aspect of it, small scale in this industry, and then there's the craft aspect of it, and then you add the decorative aspect of it. And that's where you have all these kinds of things. In fact, a government report of 1848 mentions bonnets of bleached grass and hats of straw are made in many rural districts. And in fact, at the Great Exposition, held in Britain's Crystal Palace in 1851, Nova Scotia had its own area displaying grass bonnets and hats. And they were displayed and awarded prizes at provincial exhibitions as early as 1854. There's a wonderful example of this kind of hat at Ross Farm. I haven't seen it in years. And I'm sure that it's probably so fragile now that they had to put it away. But it was a typical kind of hat for funerals. And chances are, shellac as well. So it would be shiny and hard and keep the rain off you at the gravesite.
Was it only for women or did they?
No. They made men's hats. Big sun hats for working out in the fields. And things like that. So it was you couldn't go to Walmart and buy yourself a straw hat. So you had to make these. And they also made them chip hats, very, very fine wood shavings. Very, again, far more time consuming, but they were like the special hats worn for Sunday. As I said earlier, both Sharon and I learned this technique. I think we never did make a hat, did we? I think we just made a couple of hot mats for the table. Yeah, because it was too much of an effort.
But it was in a workshop.
But we learned it from Jane Hills, from the New Ross area, the late Jane Hills. And she learned that from her mother. And she said the children, when she was growing up, the children would braid and the mother would assemble the hats. Because they not only made them for the family, but they would make them for sale. And our dear friend, Jolene Gordon, many of you might know her from the marvelous publications she has put out through the Nova Scotia Museum. She's documented the Black and Mi'kmaq basketry techniques with the tradition bearers, and she's also had worked with Jane Hills before she passed, and produced a book called Hand-Woven Hats. There's people in the province. There were people in the province. There are still people in the province working very hard to save these kinds of things, to save these techniques, to save these kinds of arts. This is what I was talking to Inga about it earlier. I mean, this is one of the things that you guys want to try to do, is make sure that this stuff is kept, or at least documented and shown. And it's about celebrating what we had and what we want to celebrate as part of our own history and our own culture. I've got one more song I want to sing for you before I just talk a little bit more. Oh my God. Going over. Only because I'm talking about straw hats and them being sold at exhibitions and fairs and stuff like that. This is a lovely song that Helen collected from Ben Henneberry on Devil's Island at the mouth of Halifax Harbor. Was on the morn of bright May day, when nature painted all things gay, taught birds to sing and lambs to play and guide the meadow hare. Returned their tongues so fond as they blessed that kind perpetual day, that flowery month in blooming May, when lovely Jenny ran away with Jockey to the fair. The village parish bells had rung, with eager steps he trudged along, his flowery garment round him hung that shepherds used to wear. tap at the window, haste, my dear. When Jenny invasion cried, who's there? It's me, my love, there's no one here. Step lightly down, you need not fear, with talking to the fair. My father and mother are fast asleep, my brothers are up and with the sheep. So will you now your promise keep, that I have heard you swear? Or will you ever constant prove, I will by all that's good, my love. I'll never deceive my charming dove. Renew those vows and haste, my love, with jockey to the fair. Then jockey did his vows renew, they pledged their love and away they flew. O'er cowslip, bell, and boggy dew, then jockey to the fair. Returned, there's none so fond as they blessed that kind perpetual day. That lovely time in blooming May, when lovely Jenny ran away with jockey to the fair. Sweet little. Can folk art be invented or innocently created? We talked about people creating things from a utilitarian point of view. My great-grandfather Burns, made all sorts of toys. He made little cradles and little rocking chairs that then he would paint in his own paint. He made beautiful decoys, utilitarian decoys. But now, decoys are one of the most prominent things collected at the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. One of the other things that he made, he was a very creative person, he made a big wooden owl that he had he put on the steps, or the fence of his house in Sherbrooke, that he built in his 70s. And he was a remarkable carver, very basic, very simple, and the eyes were soda pop caps that he nailed in. And I remember a number of years ago, I'd say maybe 20 years ago, I had this owl. I thought, what in the hell am I going to do with this? And it started to fall apart. And so I called the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia, and they came up to our house, and they looked at the owl, and they said, well, we'd love to have it, but it would cost a fortune, because it would have to go in a tank and have resins put in it and stuff like that. So they said, we just don't have the money to do that, but we'll take that decoy over there. And at the time, I wasn't ready to get it. I'm glad I didn't, because they have lots of decoys. And it would have been lovely to have my great-grandfather represented in the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. But right now, that decoy is on the hearth of the house my great-grandfather built in Sherbrooke of his great-great-grandson. So that's where it needs to be. At this point in time, that's where that piece of folk art needs to be. And then we look at folk art as created to say, is it really folk art? You remember the fad, really in the 80s, I remember it, of the butterflies on the wall of your house. And often they were incremental steps. You threw the big one, little one, little one. I remember when I was working on CBC radio, CBC Main Street, I did a show on these butterflies, and I did all sorts of research on them. Well, really nobody knows sort of where they came from. We're talking about, did somebody invent them? Other people say, oh, they came from Scandinavia. I did research on that. And somebody said, oh, no, the traditional Mi'kmaq belief that if a butterfly lands on the outside of your lodge or your teepee, that it's considered good luck. None of my Mi'kmaq tradition bearer informants ever knew anything about that. But that it became a form of folk art, and everybody and their dog was making these butterflies. And then you can start to see them, okay, these are very sophisticated. They're doing stencils now. So the folk art can have a commercial aspect of it too, and the people jump on the bandwagon and say, okay, there's something to be made for this. I don't see them around. I don't see them being sold. Iconography as part of folk art. A good example is playing cards. When my ancestors came here, when Jacob Kraft and his second wife came and were given property in Lunenburg and Second Peninsula and Garden lots, their lot was chosen for them by a playing card. And those playing cards were utilitarian, but somebody had to produce the art and paint that on those cards. Now, Newfoundland has a couple of those. They don't have my particular spade that was done. In this area, the stunningly beautiful regalia on the oxen. Weather vanes. Here's an excellent example, you know, the weather vane. Down in Sherbrooke, of course, the St. Mary's River, the Anglican Church down there has a gorgeous bee salmon. Those are all produced by artists, not necessarily to go in a museum, but to be utilitarian as well. So the folk art has two different meanings. This is something that I always talk about. I remember years and years ago, some of you are my vintage, at historic properties in the 70s, there used to be a bookstore called A Pair of Trindles. And it was a marvelous bookstore. And I remember one time there was a big book, coffee table book, in there of kitsch. You know, things that are tasteful or tasteless, you know. And I'm looking through it and going, yeah, I have that. So it's an age-old thing, you know, it's somebody's art, somebody's folk art. And I think very often what we do is sometimes we will not accept something until it is accepted by the bigger world. Mm. I would love to have, no, I wouldn't love to have, because I would feel guilty about taking it. I was going to say I'd love to have $1 for every time somebody mentions a story about collecting something from Maud Lewis, you know, and how they got it for $5 or they did that. You know, I would give the money back to Maud if she was alive. But that's the kind of thing, you know, people say, oh, you know, I stopped by and there's this funny old lady and I bought it and I just threw that in the attic and all. It's worth something now. But do you like it anymore? Is the value gone? You hear that all the time. You watch Antiques Roadshow or something like that. Oh, well, I guess I'll take it out of the attic now. Somebody else has given it validation. My feeling is, if the folk art speaks to your heart, then it's valid. You don't need anybody else to tell you that gorgeous little bird over there on the table is charming and whimsical and will make you feel delightful when you walk in the room. Maybe somebody else has to tell you that it's worth more than you think it is, but that's the whole concept of folk art. So how can it be saved? One of the then you're dealing with how difficult it is to retain that. And textiles are one of the worst things in the world because they deteriorate and they require acid-free papers and things like that. So when you're thinking about that kind of collecting, you also have to think of how can I make sure we have the training. We were fortunate in the 70s and 80s. The Canadian Conservation Museum were constantly sending people around and giving workshops. So we had workshops on textiles and on artifacts and things like that, which is one of the reasons I was hired to look after the artifacts of the archives. That was one of my first jobs at the archives. So it's the whole idea of how can we preserve it? What is the best way? And you're going to be looking at collections and saying, okay, well these are in pristine condition, but do I spend $1,000 on an item to try to get a professional conservator to come in and care for that? I have one more story I want to share with you. I'm not going to hit you with it. Janet would have my head for it if I did. This wooden spoon. You know, utilitarian wooden spoon. It's a folk craft. It was just made last summer. What value does it have? To me, to me it has great value because it comes with a story that has touched my heart deeply. In 1933, Helen Creighton and her collecting companion, Doreen Sr., who was a musicologist from England, visited the home of Anne Greenough in West Pepeswick. And there, for the first time, Helen Creighton heard Farewell to Nova Scotia. Mrs. Greenough was the first person to sing that for her. She subsequently found several other versions of it. And there's many things written about it. I have a chapter in my book, Chocolates, Tattoos, and Mayflowers, of the history of Farewell to Nova Scotia, that whole concept. But what the story I want to share with you is that the house was gone when I came along. And Helen always said, she told me about Mrs. Greeno and she would go back and visit. So I've been doing some work with the folks at the Muscatawba Railway Museum because Helen collected so many songs and stories in that area. They have a lovely exhibit on her work and the people that she collected from, which is the most important thing, with the tradition bearers that shared with her. So I said to Tegan, I said, I'd love to just go and see where Helen collected this song, this iconic song. So she said, well, the house is gone, but she said, I know people that have it now. They built another house on the site. So she made arrangements, and Sharon and I went down, and we met a delightful couple. They built a beautiful big house. I mean, it's just gorgeous, overlooking Peswick Harbor. It's up on a high hill, but they kept the original knoll where the Greeno house was, where Annie and her husband Dennis Greeno lived. The little house, and Helen said it just had a big wood stove, and when she and Doreen went, and Mrs. Greeno said, well, just sit down, dear, their socks were wet from the wet grass, and their shoes were wet. Helen and Doreen put their feet in the oven. Mrs. Greeno made something out of Helen said, I can't remember whether it was biscuits or cookies, but it was something she gave us with a cup of tea. And she said, and then Helen said, well, Mrs. Greeno, do you know any of the old-time songs? And lo enough, Mrs. Greeno knew several, including Farewell to Nova Scotia. So we went to the house. Marvelous, wonderful couple. She was an arborist, but both of them. She was in that military, still worked for the military. He worked out west, so this was their gorgeous summer / retirement home. So we were talking about the house, and there was a little gnarled thing, and she said, well, I told them not to touch the big apple tree, because she said that was original to the property. But she said, when I got here, they had started to do something, and Sharon, if I get any of this mixed up, please correct me, because I don't want to be wrong in the story. Long and short of it was, she was able to save a piece of the apple tree. So it was this gorgeous little sapling that was growing. And she said, but the rest of the wood's all down there. And I said, do you think I could have a piece? Well, of course you can. So she went and she got me this piece of the size of that. Long, gnarled piece with burls in it, as you can see, things like that. And I said, oh, this is great. Because I said, I'm going to take it down to the wood shop in Sherbrooke. Because when our ancestral apple tree had to be removed from our property in Sherbrooke, I had them make spoons, wooden spoons, for all of my cousins and people in the family. So we all have a spoon from Granny and Grampy's apple tree. So I said, I'm going to do the same thing. And Tegan says, well, you know, my father is a wood carver. He'll probably do that for you. I said, well, that would be wonderful, somebody from the area. She said, you know, he lived in that house. She said, when my mother and father were first together, they lived in a little cabin in the woods, and then they wanted to get closer. And at that time, Dennis had died. He used to work in the local area with all sorts of various things, including they had a little mini gold mine in the area as well. He used to do some work there. And he said, well, you know, she said, Mom and Dad lived there for a while. So I said, this is fascinating. He said, he's the perfect person to carve these things. A man that used to live in that house. So he wasn't around at the time, so we made arrangements for him. And I said, oh, I want to pay you for this. He said, no. He said, I have all of your books except 4. He said, so I want your 4 books signed. Well, anyway, we ended up paying him for more than he did for us. So we went down to meet him, and again, you never know where a story leads. He said, when we moved into the house, he said, the big stove was in the middle of the floor. The stove was in the middle of the floor. He said the attic wasn't even finished. And he said it was a very old-fashioned house. One side was a living area, the other side was a sleeping area. And he said, obviously, Dennis, I mean, he's from the area, so he knows all these people. Dennis used to work in the gold mines there, and he was obviously going and maybe getting gold. And so he said, the house wasn't used, Annie had died, we were renting it from Annie's sister. He said, when we got there, the floorboards were fairly wide, as the old floorboards are, and the gaps in between. He said, you look down, and there were sparkles. There was gold dust in the floorboards of the house where Helen Creighton collected Fairweather, Nova Scotia. So that's why this spoon is such a treasure for me. It's a utilitarian item. To me, it's a cherished piece of folk art that I will pass on with a story. And that's what it's all about. The story that can come with it. The story of the person who created it. When I was asking Helen what the most important thing was, what she did, she said, I saved it for other people to use. And the other important thing she told me, the last thing I'm going to leave you with, is she said about the people that shared the stories with her. And shared the fact of, in Lunenburg counties, people showed her linen stockings that were knit in the 18th century. Things like that. She said, they shared those with me. She said, remember, Clary, they are the teachers. You are the student. And I leave that with you. When you are looking at folk art, when you're looking at collectors, their story about what they created is probably as important as the artifact itself. And from a museum point of view, the intellectual information and a photograph or the documentation of nowadays, you're looking at 3D kinds of things. There are museums in the world, in Iran and things like that, that those artifacts are completely destroyed. But if you have the digital information, and at least something of that life is saved. So from a folk art perspective, for me anyway, the story is as important as the piece. So thank you very much. I will pretend to have answers if you have questions. Yes?
Whatever had happened to that rug, it had the swastikas on it.
Fortunately, there were, well, how many rugs did we document from that house? About 14.
Yes.
It's still pride of place in the house and will be passed on to other family members.
What does the Art Museum of Nova Scotia have to say about that?
I don't even know, to be honest with you, I don't even know if they know about it.
Well, they might know about it.
They might
It's a
know
separate
about it.
organization who took it on,
Mm-hmm.
and they got a grant. And it was about just the evidence of having it. It's online. You can actually look it up. There's rugs on there.
No, that rug isn't online. They wouldn't put it up.
No, I'm not that rug.
Oh yeah, that's
just in general.
Nova Scotia Rug Registry, yeah. I have a feeling that the art gallery knew about it because our friends, Martha and Robin Creighton, who are gone now, were great art collectors, and they were collectors of Inuit art, collectors of Nova Scotia art, and they actually had the folks from the art gallery of Nova Scotia come down and go through their entire house.
I don't know at that point if they were offering.
And I don't know if they were offering.
They were offering the artwork on
Yeah.
the walls. I mean, yeah, so I don't know if they were.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Is the registry still documenting pieces?
You know,
Oh yes, yes.
during COVID, they did 120 rugs. Like during COVID, somehow they got it started, and I guess maybe people like us, we went out into the community and we volunteered to do, as many as we could.
And one of the tragic things that happened is that the fire just off of the Hammonds Plains Road, the woman that we were working with, Linda, she lost her house and all the documentation that went with it.
Mm.
Fortunately, somebody else had.
She lost her artifact.
She lost all of her rug collection.
One of the things that Claire and I have a dilemma about is who are we going to give our treasures to? We don't have children.
Yeah.
And do we give them back to the families that their ancestors made it? Who do we give it back to so that it will keep on being appreciated and being known about?
This basket is a good example.
Mm.
Do we get in touch with Nancy Lucas's family? Is there anybody that would even want that? And sometimes people would say, well, I'll just take it, whatever. Now, Edith Clayton's daughter, she actually has a small museum in her house. That could go to the Black Cultural Center too. But you will know this yourselves, and you will find this out if you develop your own repository. you only have so much exhibit space. And people say, well, I donated my great-grandmother's antique shawl and they've never put it on
You
display.
make
Well,
sure that it's
you know.
Helen Creighton's dress, I made
Yeah.
clothes for Helen. And then the nieces got a piece of clothes, and it was like, well, I'll donate it as long as you guarantee that it'll be displayed. Well, I
No
can't do
guarantee.
that, and I
Yeah.
won't. So I never got one of them in particular to put into the Dartmouth Museum because she wanted a guarantee.
We can probably talk after you have a knock of pineapple or something like that. But thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
This has been totally special. I think we all feel we've had wonderful, wonderful experiences after musical and otherwise. That was a sidebar. Thank you so much. And we've all learned a lot. And we all possess something that we are worrying about. Every one of us, or we wouldn't be here. We're wondering, where are we going with it?
Yeah.
What, and we all have kids that come home and say, Mom, what am I going to do with all this stuff? And that girl respects it, but she can't imagine absorbing it, into their family. And so, with the center, with the hopes of a folk arts center, located here in Lunenburg County, the goal and objective of the Folk Arts Society, we should hope that we can take a certain amount, but as you say, you can't take it all. And that we can take that which has a story, and a background, and an essence, and that we can treat it properly, and put it out there for the public to enjoy, to respect, and to educate. And we would look forward to having school children and whatnot come through this spot that we can share stories, because it's incumbent upon us to pass it on to the next generation.
They're the next generation by months of this stuff. Save it.
Let's hope they do. Let's hope they do. But thank you for this afternoon. Thank you, and thank you, Sharon, for your help on that. You did it.